He's an honest-to-goodness, brilliant intellectual. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, one of the sharpest analysts of the American empire, foreign policy, the myths that we tell ourselves as a nation. He has several acclaimed books, including The Empire of Necessity, Fordlandia, and The End of the Myth. That won the Pulitzer in 2020. In his book, America, America, he explores how the U.S. has exported its contradictions, its democracy, its violence beyond just the borders, and how that global projection has shaped who we are at home. He's a former professor of history at NYU, frequent contributor to The Nation, The New York Times, The Intercept. He challenges us to sort of reconsider the narratives that define American identity. So excited to talk to the great Greg Grandin, everyone. Hello, sir.
Hello. It's great to be here.
So excited to talk to you because I feel you've met your moment. I mean, we see sort of the myth of American exceptionalism falling apart in so many different ways, but you detail how we've exported it. I'd love to get into the book specifically, but I'd also like to just have you comment on this moment in history where I feel as though sort of a lot of our preconceptions about the country in which we live may be faltering.
Yeah, and that a lot had to do with my last book, The End of the Myth. We were living through the end of the myth, and the argument of that book was that we were a nation formed in expansion. The idea of limitlessness in all its many varieties, territorial markets, wars, the idea that you can organize domestic politics by constantly promising expansion or promising limitlessness. The idea of the frontier, what was great about the idea of the frontier is that you could project it into infinity. But the fact of the matter is we're living in a world in which that's no longer the case. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's no more righteous moral wars to fight. Just look at the way Gaza is sucking everything in. The financial collapse and the restructuring of the U.S. economy, and probably the greatest limit of all is climate change. So having lost the ability to kind of project our power beyond the borders at will, and then to use that projection to organize domestic politics, right?
And
We can no longer outsource our polarization. We can no longer no longer roll over the trauma from the last war into the next war. So it all just kind of flies around the heartland, and that explains the rise of Donald Trump. That's the argument of the end of the myth, right?
Sure. Donald Trump then benefited, and Republicans, by virtue of the fact that they were adjacent to Donald Trump, and they have benefited a lot from this period. I mean, they benefited from frustration then, from like a lot of what you're talking about, the backlash that was inevitable, given sort of the end of the old way in which we did things in America. So frustration, I guess what I'm getting at, public frustration, public anger, this manifested itself in the rise of this guy.
Yeah, and I think there were real policy decisions made after the Cold War to deregulate, to outsource, to privatize, to impose austerity. I think I think that it created economic globalization, created a dual economy in which 30% do well and we do wonderful and it's great, and and 60% struggle and have they're the people that Bernie Sanders talks about. They're the people that work every day, 2 jobs, and Democratic politics and the party has been blind to that, and it created a vacuum that Donald Trump and the nativists exploited. There's deep roots of that kind of racism and nativism in this country, but it used to be kept on the fringes. As we move forward, you can keep the extremism at the fringes. Now that we can't move, now that there is no promise of a future, right? That extremism comes and it kind of it's self-consuming.
In other words, the promise of the future couldn't be effectively sold anymore. Is that what you mean when you say there's no promise of a future? It
Yeah,
becomes
yeah. Who
obvious
talks
to
about the
people.
future
Yeah,
anymore, right? I mean, Woodrow Wilson promised a world without war. FDR promised a world without want. Today's politicians promise nothing, and that's the again, not to keep going back. I want to talk about the new book, but to go back to the last book is that the myth of the frontier, the myth of an endless frontier is substituted by the myth of a border wall, right? The border wall becomes the substitutes for the frontier. And in some ways, even though Donald Trump denies climate change, he's the first climate change politician. He's basically saying, this the liberal promise, that all will rise up, all will sit at the table. He's saying it's nonsense, and that resonates with people. So the idea is that we can build a wall and we can continue living the way that we have been living, which of course is another myth. We can't do that either.
but that's interesting because that's exactly where I come down on Trump and those who are really climate crisis denialists. But I mean, Trump is aggressive in his denialism, sort of wanting to get it back to the way it was. Everything from coal plants to combustion engines to, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
totally ignoring where
The shower heads, the
right.
water.
It's yeah. It's like, don't worry, I'm going to take you back to
Yeah,
the life you had. Right.
yeah, and it's another myth. And obviously the denial is so over the top. It's obviously an acceptance, right? There's obviously an awareness that that the world is brutal and we have to keep the barbarians out. And that's what Trumpism is founded on. Now, in the past, I just do want to say, in the past, we hit limits. The Great Depression, and that's nativism, building walls, and racism is not the only response to an acceptance of limits. Right, the New Deal was an acceptance of limits. Right, a new concept of social citizenship in which we reorganize the economy to benefit people. And so I'm not saying Trump's realism is realistic. It's no more real. You could have a different alternative, and
Sure. Sure.
right.
But I'm glad you mentioned this because I'm curious, and you're just the guy to ask because as a historian, you can give me a sense and give all of us a sense of what was happening at the time of the Depression. You had so many disenfranchised Americans, I mean, desperate for anything. It was an inflection moment. It could have gone so many different ways, I guess. I'm asking really, was the number of those who were so desperately angry and frustrated with the system, or the ways in which that manifested itself, was it so much different then than it is now?
It what no, I mean, I think it could have gone in either way, and in many countries it did go either way, right? The challenges to liberalism, whether it be from the left or the right, were profound. And in most countries that had a Labor Party or a Social Democratic Party, you were able to save procedural democracy. The United States is unique in that it saved procedural democracy without a Labor Party and without social democracy, largely through the New Deal. And not to make a segue into the new book, but Latin America was absolutely key to saving the New Deal during a very dark moment. But FDR's first term, the Liberty Leagues were on the march. The fascists were on the march. They were extremists on the radio using the new technology of radio. He had lost his elite support. FDR, a number of corporations backed away from him and was supporting paramilitaries. I mean, U.S. businesses had some of the largest paramilitary organizations in the world, Ford Motor Company and so on, and certainly planters and the like. And so things were dark in the 1930s, as dark as now. But what there was a vision, an alternative vision. I'll say it very simply: you don't beat fascism by calling people fascists. You beat fascism by offering them an alternative. And the Democratic Party, for many reasons that we can't get into in a short show, was primed to offer an alternative. Something approximating social democracy and dignity, and that's what FDR was. And I think that's why he was able to kind of beat back the forces of reaction, because he wasn't just you know, trying to figure out how to appeal to like the suburban voter or whatever these abundance nunigs think that they're doing or whatever.
No,
He
yeah, you're right.
spoke in a strong, forceful voice for like for improving the material conditions of people's lives. And so he welded liberalism, or he renovated liberalism by with what we today would call socialism or social democracy. And that's what beat extremism and fascism in the United States.
That's so interesting. And you're right. We've sort of commoditized all of these different voting groups. And so we target them in all of these different ways. And it's easy to lose the plot. Like, as you say, it's like you can't just call the rise of authoritarianism, fascism, oligarchy, whatever. You need to have a plan.
You need to have an alternative. People want an alternative. They want, and they're ready for an alternative. But
and so they were ready to embrace a guy who's just blowing sunshine, and they're just hoping that maybe some of that sunshine is for real.
Yeah.
All right. Now let me ask you about the book, America, America. So again, this is Latin America, which is why it's America and then America.
Yeah, that's why there's America, right. America, America. That's why there's an accent on it.
So tell me about Latin America and its importance in all of this.
Yeah.
And its history is fascinating, I think. Yeah?
The book is a 500-year history from the Spanish conquest to the present, and it argues that you can't understand the United States without also understanding Latin America. I talk about it starts with the conquest. It starts with the strong moral reaction, backlash by some Catholics against the violence of the conquest. And that creates the conditions of, in some ways, of political modernism. I don't want to go into all of the details, but this becomes a kind of critique that Latin Americans then apply later to the United States. So there's a back and forth. There's a kind of ideological contest between America and America, between the Spanish Empire and the British Empire, and then later between Latin America and the United States. And the argument is that basically that contest, the big meta argument, creates the conditions for what gets put into place after World War II, the liberal international order. Basically, the Latin America comes into being already a League of Nations, already a United Nations, 7 independent republics that both threatened and legitimated each other. They had to figure out a new way to organize international politics. They couldn't use what the United States was using. The United States renovated the doctrine of conquest. The founding of the United States, the leaders of the United States, and then up through the early 20th century, said that the doctrine of conquest was valid, as a way of taking Mexican land, taking Indian land. That Latin Americans couldn't do that. I mean, otherwise, Argentina might look at the Pacific and say, we want the Pacific, just like the United States has the Pacific.
But when you say they couldn't do it, they couldn't countenance it. That is to say, they couldn't
countenance it, right?
Okay,
because they were independent republics. So there emerges a notion of independent nation states that have to learn how to live with each other. United Nations, a League of Nations, and all of the legal foundation, a rejection of aggressive war, a recognition of national sovereignty, the presumption that the international order should be founded on cooperation, not competition, not inherent competition. All of these ideas that get put into place with the United Nations in 1945 come out of Latin America, and come out of Latin America's long contestation with the United States. And so that's the argument of the book. And then, of course, it runs through the Cold War and the unraveling, and I bring it up to the present, and in some ways Gaza and Trump. But I couldn't just leaving it on the doorstep of Gaza and Trump.
You do talk about in the book moral fatigue, and I'm wondering, you talk about sort of an empire's moral fatigue. And so as you look at the American empire, I'm wondering how you see that moral fatigue, showing up just in the way that we do everything from, civics to media to politics to whatever. Like where is this? First, tell me what moral fatigue of the empire is, and then tell me how it shows up in these places.
Well, I think it harkens back to what we were talking about earlier: a lack of a vision of a future, a kind of a kind of inability to come up with an invigorating way of mobilizing people to think of what a positive good would be. Because for so long, the United States' vision of a positive good, to go back to the earlier part of the conversation, was expansion. The welfare of the Commonwealth was dependent on keeping the frontier open. And whether that frontier not be land of the frontier, but in terms of markets, in terms of moralistic wars. Now that that's no longer possible, there's no sense of what a positive vision of the Commonwealth would be. And here's how I put it in the book. If you want to understand the difference between Latin America and the United States, you have to understand the difference between social rights and individual rights. Social rights, every Latin American country has, even conservatives, understand citizenship as comprising a balance of individual rights. The state stays out of your business when it comes to religion and when it comes to speech and assembly and things like that, due process. But they also believe in social rights, that the state actually is active, that it takes a role in taxing surplus wealth and then redistributing it in the form of a social wage, education, healthcare. As Bernie Sanders says, there's no nation in the world, no nation in Latin America, every nation in Latin America has the right to healthcare enshrined in its Social Citizenship. The United States is almost obsessional in holding on to individual rights as the only legitimate rights. And this is one of the things that motivates the intellectual right, I think, is this fear that, and a lot of it has to do with the migration crisis, that migrants are actually bringing different conceptions of citizenship here. There is this obsession with keeping the Constitution pure, original, only, where a virtuous state is only job is to stand down and to protect individual rights. It's not to distribute healthcare or education. All in Latin America, all of those goods, those common goods, are enshrined in their constitutions. And this is one of the things that I think leads to moral fatigue, because it takes a lot to maintain the cult of individual rights.
I see.
It's exhausting to, and it's punitive. It's odd. Like, it would be nice if we all had healthcare. If you have to fill out forms for everything. If
Sure.
you had universal daycare.
I mean, so these two, this large area of Latin America, it encompasses so much of this region, and then our position, which is, keep those, this is our position now, keep those from Latin America from, getting in any further and changing the character of this country. The realities are that life is checkerboarded down there. That is to say, it's really good in some places and really rough in others, and that there is there's a legitimate migration fleeing really awful conditions in some places and going to some places in Latin America that are so good. When help, and I know that's a whole book you've written on it. So, but how did this all happen? How did it evolve to this place where some things are so wondrous in Latin America and some are so corrupt, so destitute, and so filled with violence?
When I say every there is this kind of social democratic tradition in Latin America, the reality for many people is misery and this crime and corruption and violence, the spread of the drug economy over the last couple of decades. I think there's different stages. You can go back to independence and the debt that Latin America fell into from Europe. The wars for independence were much longer than the U.S. war for independence, and Latin America was immediately in debt. The United States could use the whole Western continent as collateral to take out more loans, and could use the whole Western, the continental collateral to engage in speculative bubbles that didn't lead to kind of political collapse, but led to growth and expansion. Whereas Latin America didn't have that kind of opportunity. There were no frontiers to speak of in Latin America. But more than that, the Cold War was devastating to Latin America. The violence of the Cold War, the fact that Latin America thought it was going to get a Marshall Plan after World War II because it all lined up behind the United States, and Truman refused to give a Marshall Plan. That basically meant that Latin America had to attract private capital, and the way that you attract private capital is by basically ensuring a pacified labor force. There was no room for a kind of middle way social democratic non-communist left like in Europe or in Japan. And then, of course, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and economic liberalization and neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, was very devastating and created that super class of billionaires, just like it hasn't here. In
So the
many ways,
neoliberalism, just
yeah,
to
in
expand,
many
it like
ways,
kicked open the markets essentially.
yeah, and in many
Yeah.
ways, what the United States imposed on Latin America, it imposed on itself. I mean, Bill Clinton took office in the middle of, at the time, was an unprecedented run of economic expansion. There wasn't an enemy in sight. The Soviet Union was gone, wiped off the face of the earth, and he treated the United States as if it was an occupied country and its citizens belligerents. They did away with welfare. They passed all those crime bills and terrorist bills and anti-immigration bills, and a lot of it really begins under Clinton to some degree. And I think we're paying the price of that. We're not, instead of taking the opportunity of the triumph of the Cold War to build a social republic that like lifts everybody up, we went whole hog. I mean, every country in the 1970s and 80s and 90s did some kind of economic restructuring because of rising energy prices and whatnot. No other country comparable to the United States in terms of wealth simultaneously assaulted the institutions that could have ameliorated that economic restructions, unions, the welfare state, small farming communities, the assault on all of those institutions that could have helped buffer the restructuring was brutal. And you didn't see that in Germany, and you didn't really see it even in Thatcher's UK. You certainly didn't see it in France, where they were still subsidizing peasants, for all I know. But here, the economic restructuring went hand in hand with this intense criminalization and militarization and a very punitive vision of the public order. And that's, I think, what we're reaping the whirlwind, I think.
And I don't mean to have the recency bias that I think we all tend to have, but as you look at this broad and detailed historical context, which you talk about in the book, America, and you bring it to today, handicap for me the world of Latin America, and then handicap for me, if you would, the USA and how we fit into it in this contemporary experience.
Handicap in the sense of
what's the future?
What's the future?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, there is no future. It's hard to imagine a future. And I think that's part of the problem. It's easier to imagine as I think Frederick Jameson, a great literary critic, once said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism or something beyond the kind of savage capitalism we live under. Latin America is more social. There's more sociality in Latin America, and which does buffer some of the worst of the violence and worst of the economic commiseration to some degree. But what we're also seeing,
why is that, Greg? Just to follow up on that for a moment, why do we see so much of it there? Yeah.
It comes out, I think, the Catholic tradition, the Spanish Empire was much more integrated. I go into this in detail in the book, how the Spanish Catholicism presumed to be universal, but recognized difference and organized the empire around. So there was no pushing difference to the frontier. There was, Native Americans were central to extracting the wealth out of the New World, but they were also morally central to justifying Spanish dominion. Whereas the British and then the US had, pushed out the Native Americans, right? It was pushing difference out to the frontier. And I think that created a degree of sociality, the endurance of a kind of agrarian culture, the strength of union movements in Latin America, the strength of social movements. I mean, the landless movement in Brazil is the largest social movement in the world. They've redistributed land, they've seized and confiscated and redistributed land the size of Switzerland. I mean, they keep fighting. More environment. I mean, the paradox is kind of hard to wrap one's mind around. More environmental activists are assassinated in Latin America than any other region every year, and yet environmental activism is strongest in Latin America than anywhere else. Like
That is wild. Yeah.
it's like it's irrepressible, and the commitment. I mean, the drug war in Mexico, but people still fight. They still fight for a decent life, and I think that has a lot going for it. What it doesn't have, one thing, going back to handicap, one thing that's troubling is that the U.S. is exporting a lot of its culture war craziness to Latin America. In the past, the conservatives in Latin America tended to be law and order, anti-communist, Hispanic patricians, that wanted a patriarchy, and now they're running around talking about Judith Butler and groomers and guns and QAnon, and it's all like cryptocurrency,
Because they've seen the effectiveness of those arguments in America.
well, yes, and because they have ties with a lot of the churches and libertarian groups that support it, and different, and there's the Bannon types, they're making ties. And in some places it's effective, in El Salvador and Ecuador, not in Mexico. In Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum has 85%. She's a Jewish daughter of refugees from the Holocaust.
It's a wild story, isn't it? Yeah.
Sitting in the Catholic vice-regal office, what used to be the viceroy's office, the most important position in all of the Americas for the Spanish Empire. And there she is, the granddaughter of Jewish refugee communists, with 85% approval rating, talking about the fourth transformation of Mexico. And by what she means by that is social democracy. She's limited. Mexico has, the Mexican state and military have these, reserves of occult power that, she can't really touch. But she's gradually changing the expectations. So she is a politician.
Right, that's the message that you were talking about at the beginning of our conversation.
He is somebody who actually does have who says, has a social vision that motivates people, and it's there in a country that's poor, that's crime-ridden, that you could see it easily vote for somebody like Bukele from El Salvador. People are tired of violence, but they don't. They vote for her.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It really is fascinating. So here's my last question, and then we'll have a link to your book. And I'd love to, you're such a great perspective in such a detailed way on history and on the evolution of various societies and cultures and countries. And I'd love to, visit with you again. But for now, do the cycles that we apply to history, the rise and fall of empires, that's like the new thing everybody's telling me about. Oh yeah, all empires rise and fall and blah blah blah. Like everybody's become an armchair historian. Are there really cycles to history? Can you find discernible cycles when you look, and is it something to plan on, or are we imposing sort of a cyclical notion after the fact?
No, I think there certainly are. I think it's true. It's obvious empires rise and fall. It's a question of why. If you people who study economic world systems, people like Giovanni Arrighi, Emmanuel Wallerstein, they understand in terms of the rise of finance capital, and when finance capital comes to dominate, it's kind of the last stage of an empire's power. But I think that's all true. But I think within that, there's still room for maneuver. Look, the British Empire was in decline after World War II, and that's when it passed its National National Institute of Health. That's when it adopted national health care, when it was in decline. right? And so, how empire, I think empires decline, that, or the cycles, I don't know where we are in the
Sure.
long Kandraki cycle of secular cycles of decline, but, there's still, one could imagine different shapes taking place, and different potentialities. And you see it in people's desire. You see it in those Bernie Sanders rallies. You see it in the protests. You just don't see it in the consultants and the lobbyists and corporations that dominate. You don't see it in what's his
Rahm Emanuel.
Ron Emanuel, and who's that? Carville, James Carville, and all of these people that have taken that have hijacked the Democratic Party. And
there's not a lot of humble in either one of those guys.
Yeah. I mean, we have to break. I mean, the state and the Democratic Party has become captive to oligarchs and to billionaires.
No,
and it just hasn't happened. I mean, it's a result of specific policies.
Sure.
The deregulation of telecommunication in the 1990s under Bill Clinton contributed to political polarization. The deregulation of finance, contributed to the extreme wealth that has concentrated. I mean, they shouldn't be billionaires. They shouldn't be, prospective trillionaires. I mean, these people shouldn't exist. I mean,
with all that money comes such immense power, and as you say, power of the political system.
The
decision-making process,
and it just turns politics into a clown show. I mean, when you have somebody like Elon Musk, and
it's interesting to hear that clown show, on some level, at least aspects of it, has been exported to Latin America, as you say.
Yeah, unfortunately, not everywhere. It's there's still good people trying to do good things.
The book is America. Greg Grandin's latest great walk through history, all of his stuff. I'll have links to it underneath this video, and this is the first of many conversations, I hope, Greg. I really enjoyed this, and thank you for being here.
So did I. I hope so too.
All right, all the best. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.